My name's Walter Hale, and I am 63 years old. On Father's Day, my daughter set a small wooden box on the table in front of me. Before I could touch it, my wife's hand closed around my wrist. "Don't open it," she said. Quiet enough that only I could hear. "Not yet. Can't you see?" He's still talking. She meant my half-brother Gary, standing at the head of that table, mid-toast, telling 22 members of our family that he had filed paperwork the week before to remove me as majority owner of our father's company. He smiled when he said it. He raised his glass. He had no idea that 3 days earlier, I had already signed the documents that made every word of his announcement worthless. I smiled. I let him finish. I let him sit back down, satisfied, sure of himself, sure of me. Then I nodded at my daughter, and she slid the box the rest of the way across the table. "I want you to understand something about my family before I go any further. We are not people who raise our voices at dinner tables. We are people who smile through things, who let silence carry the weight. Words are too dangerous to hold. So when I say the room went quiet, I mean it went quieter than usual, which in our family is its own kind of alarm. Before I tell you what was inside it, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back 7 years, to a workshop that smelled like sawdust and machine oil. When my father said something to me, I didn't understand until that box was sitting in front of me. My father built Hale Hardware from a single rented storefront in 1968, and he ran it the way he did everything, with his sleeves rolled up and his hands never quite clean. The back office smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, a smell that lived in the walls no matter how many times my mother tried to air it out. There was a particular sound the office door made, a low groan on its hinge, that told you someone was coming before you saw them. I can still hear it if I close my eyes. I was 30 then, working the floor most days, learning the business, the slow way inventory, ledgers, customers who'd known my father for decades. My half-brother Gary, 4 years older, worked there too, though worked is generous. He showed up for the parts that looked good on Paper Supplier, lunches, ribbon cuttings, anything with his name attached to a headline. There's one October evening I returned too often. My father and I were closing up. The light gone amber through the front windows, and he was running his thumb along the edge of an old oak counter he'd built himself the first year the store opened. The wood was worn smooth in places, from 40 years of hands. "This counter's outlived 3 recessions and 1 flood," he said. "You know why? Because he built it so no single piece could be pulled out without the whole thing coming apart with it." He wasn't talking about the counter. I understood that even then, though I didn't understand what he meant by it. I asked him what he meant. He just smiled and said, "You'll know when you need to know." Gary was in the office that same evening, on the phone with a supplier, using a tone I'd never once heard my father use. Clipped, transactional. Already negotiating for something that wasn't his yet. Once things change around here, it was Saline. We'll talk about better terms. My father caught my eye through the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just went back to the ledger in front of him. Our family dinners were warm in the parts that involved my father and cold in the parts that involved Gary's plans. A new car, a bigger house, always funded by some version of the business. Eventually, my mother had passed years before, and my father never remarried. So it was the 3 of us most Sundays. The smell of his pot roast, thick in the small kitchen. Gary checking his watch before dessert was even served. I sensed, even then, that Gary saw the company the way you'd see a house you were waiting to inherit rather than a place you were meant to live. I had no proof, just a small, cold draft under a closed door. There's a particular Saturday morning I still return to, the store not yet open. My father teaching me how to balance, the register the old way, with a pencil and a paper ledger instead of the new machine he didn't trust yet. His hands were rough, the pencil small in them, and he moved slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything that mattered to him. Numbers don't lie, he told me, but people misread them on purpose all the time. You watch for that. I nodded like I understood. I didn't. Not really. Not until years later, standing in a hallway, listening to my brother describe our father's decisions as sentiment getting in the way of good business. My father was diagnosed with heart failure the spring I turned 30. He held on for 8 more months, most of them spent in his recliner by the window, the store's monthly reports still arriving on his lap every Friday out of habit. Gary visited more in those 8 months than he had in the 5 years before them. I thought, at the time, it was grief moving him early. I understand now it was arithmetic. 2 weeks after the funeral, I stood outside my father's old office. I'd taken to sitting in there some evenings, in his chair, going through what was left. And I heard Gary on the phone in the hallway, his voice bright in a way it hadn't been since he was a young man closing a deal he was proud of. He's not equipped to run this the way it needs to be run, he was sighing. Dad let sentiment get in the way of good decisions for 40 years. I'm not going to make that mistake. Once I've got the votes, we restructure the whole thing. Sell off the 2 smaller locations. Bring in real management. A pause, then a laugh. Easy and certain. Walter will come around. He always does. I stood very still in the hallway. I did not open the door. I went home that night, sat in my own kitchen with a cup of coffee I never drank, and thought about my father's hand on that oak counter. I want to be honest about what I felt. It wasn't anger. Anger would have burned fast and been done with. What I felt was recognition, the particular chill of watching a shape you'd suspected in the dark finally step into the light. I had spent years making excuses for Gary to myself. He loves the company in his own way. He just shows it differently. Sitting in my kitchen that night, I understood my father had stopped making those excuses a long time before I had. He'd started calling it something else. Restructuring. Modernizing. Modernizing. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love. I decided, that night, that I would stop warning Gary about anything. Stop softening the path in front of him. I didn't know yet what my father had done to prepare for this. I only knew I was done being the one who kept the peace. I remember, a few days later, watching Gary walk through the store with a man in a good suit who wasn't a customer, pointing at shelving, murmuring numbers, the 2 of them nodding at each other like men closing something. I didn't ask who he was. I didn't need to. I just kept stalking the shelf I was working on, letting him believe I hadn't noticed a thing. That is the moment I became invisible to Gary, and the moment I decided to let him believe it. In the weeks that followed, I started noticing all the small ways Gary had already begun treating the company like something waiting to be divided. He mentioned, more than once, a friend of his who did corporate restructuring and could take a lot of this off my plate. He suggested, gently, that I take some time off, that he could hold things down while I grieved. Each time, I smiled, said I'd think about it, and quietly kept a record of every conversation. Every email he copied me on that used words like optimize and streamline for a business my father had run on handshake deals and long memory. 3 days later, going through my father's desk, I found an envelope taped beneath the bottom drawer. My name written across the front in his uneven, arthritic hand. Inside was a single card, the name and number of an attorney, Grace Coleman, and 4 words. Call her, she'd explain. I sat with that envelope for 2 days before I made the call. On the 3rd morning, I did. Grace Coleman's voice had the calm of someone used to delivering enormous news gently. I've been expecting to hear from you, Mr. Hale, she said. Your father restructured the company's ownership 18 months before he passed. The controlling shares are held in an irrevocable trust with you as sole trustee. Any vote to remove you as majority owner requires trustee approval. Gary can file whatever paperwork he likes. Without your signature, none of it has legal weight. I sat in my father's chair, the phone warm against my ear, and primera la jugide, not because anything was funny, but because I finally understood the oak counter, the unfinished sentence. 7 years of asterisk. You'll know when you need to know asterisk. He hadn't just been building furniture that couldn't be pulled apart piece by piece. he'd built the company the same way, and he'd done it while Gary was still negotiating better terms for a business that wasn't his yet. Grace walked me through it slowly. My father had structured the trust so that any attempt to force a vote would trigger a mandatory review by the trustee, me, before it could proceed. Gary's paperwork, filed with the state, would sit dormant until I chose to act on it or ignored it entirely. I asked Grace why my father hadn't simply told Gary the company would never be his to restructure alone, a plain conversation that might have avoided all of this. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. He told me he'd had that conversation more times than he could count, in different words, about different things, she said. He said it never changed anything, he said, showing him might. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. My father had spent decades hoping words would reach Gary. In his final year, he'd finally stopped hoping and started building instead. Grace also showed me the paperwork. Gary had filed with the state a petition to dissolve the existing ownership structure, citing my diminished involvement in Gary's own 3 decades of informal leadership. Reading it, I understood for the first time how long he must have been planning this, how many small conversations and supplier lunches had been, in hindsight, quiet groundwork. My father had understood it too. He'd simply started building his answer years before Gary finished asking the question. 2 weeks later, I heard Gary on the phone again, naming a date. The Father's Day gathering, 3 weeks out. And telling someone he planned to announce the restructuring there, in front of the whole family, so nobody can pretend to be surprised later. I texted Grace 2 words that night. Asterisk, he's moving. Asterisk, she replied within the hour. Asterisk, let him. Asterisk. I remember standing at my kitchen window that night, watching the yard go dark, thinking about Gary somewhere across town, confident, already rehearsing a toast for a company that had never been his to restructure. He would go to that gathering, certain he had already won. He had no idea he'd already lost. Have you ever had to stay silent to protect yourself, even when every part of you wanted to speak up? Tell me. In the comments. I read them. Grace laid out the plan over coffee that Friday. She would prepare a formal trustee decision, a single document, signed and notarized, reaffirming my full authority and formally rejecting Gary's restructuring petition. My daughter Sarah, who'd been quietly helping Grace assemble the paperwork for weeks, would deliver it to me at the Father's Day gathering itself in a box, so I could produce it the moment it mattered. You could end this quietly, before Father's Day, Grace said. 1 phone call to Gary. He'd be furious, but it would end there, privately. I thought about that for a long moment. Part of me wanted to spare him the public weight of it, but I thought about my father's hand on that oak counter, about 18 months of careful planning he'd done without telling either of us, timed to hold until exactly the moment someone tried to take it apart. He hadn't built this to humiliate Gary. He'd built it to be undeniable, in front of everyone who needed to stop wondering whether I was strong enough to hold what he'd left me. No, I told Grace. Let it happen the way he planned it. There's a part of this I haven't said yet. Grace also told me, that same Friday, that my father had left a private letter for Gary as well, held with the trust documents to be given to him. Only after everything was settled. She wouldn't tell me what it said. That's between them, she told me. He asked me to make sure it reached him, win or lose. I sat with that a long while. That even in preparing to stop Gary, my father had also prepared something soft for him. Something I wasn't meant to see. It told me more about the kind of man my father had been than anything else in that folder. A week before the gathering, Garrick had jed me warmer than he'd been in months. I've been thinking, Walter, he said, maybe after everything settles, you and I could core in things differently. Family should stick together on this. A pause, timed, soft. Dad would have wanted that. I recognized the shape of it instantly. The fake kindness that arrives right before someone needs your goodwill for something else. I'll think about it, I said. He sounded satisfied. It always did. When I said it, that same week Sarah asked me why I'd been so quiet lately. I told her I was thinking about her grandfather. That was true, though it wasn't the whole truth, and she knew it the way daughters always know when their fathers are folding a bigger feeling into a smaller sentence. She didn't push. She just started coming by the store more often after school hours, sitting at the front counter, doing homework, keeping me company without ever saying that's what she was doing. I went to the store alone the night before the gathering, sat in my father's old chair in the back office, ran my thumb along the edge of that oak counter, the way he used to. I let myself feel, fully, how much I missed him, and how strange it was that even now, he was still protecting what he'd built. I almost called Gary that night. I almost warned him. The way I'd smoothed his path my whole life. The way I'd told myself for years that he loved the company in his own way. I wish this were different. I wish Gary had been the kind of brother who would have earned his place instead of maneuvered for it. I wish he had wanted the store the way our father did. For what it gave to people. Not what it could be sold for. But wishes don't hold up. The trust our father built does. I cried that night, quietly, alone in that office, not from weakness, but because I finally understood, completely, what my father had known and I hadn't wanted to admit. I did not call Gary, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to turn. I signed the trustee document 3 nights before Father's Day at 11:50 p.m., alone at my kitchen table. Grace joined by video call to witness it. Her office lamp the only light behind her. "Once you sign, Mr. Hale," she said, "Gary's petition is formally and permanently rejected. Your position is unassailable. Legally, this ends tonight." I signed. Where she showed me, my hand was steadier than I expected it to be. "Your father would be proud of how you've handled this," Grace said, closing her folder. Quietly, without cruelty. That's harder than the alternative. 12:03 a.m. I am 63. I am the sole trustee of my father's company. And, as of that signature, the matter was already settled. 3 days before Gary would stand up at a family table and announce a plan that no longer existed. And across town, in his own kitchen, Gary was almost certainly still rehearsing his toast, still choosing which relatives to look at when he said the word restructuring. He'd find out otherwise in about 7 hours. Father's Day arrived warm and bright, the kind of afternoon that makes you forget, briefly, what's coming. Gary stood at the head of the table with his glass raised, and he said exactly what Grace had predicted he would, that he'd filed the paperwork, that he was taking the company in a new direction, that it was, in his words, time for real leadership. He looked at me while he said it, waiting for my face to fall. My wife's hand closed around my wrist before I could reach for the box. "Don't open it," she said quietly. "Not yet." "Can't you see he's still talking?" I waited until he sat back down, glass still raised, smiling at the table like a man who'd already won. Then I nodded at Sarah, and she slid the box across to me. Inside was the trustee document, notarized, dated 3 days earlier, along with a copy of Gary's own petition stamped denied rejected by trustee of record, across the top in Grace's clean handwriting. I set both documents on the table without a word and slid them toward him. Around us, 22 relatives went very still, forks halfway to mouths, the way a room goes when it senses something has already happened that it wasn't invited to witness. He looked at me like I was still the brother he'd grown up, assuming he could outmaneuver. I wasn't. I hadn't been for 18 months. The silence at that table lasted longer than his toast had. Grace Single, quotes. Letter for Gary was in a second, smaller envelope inside that same box. I didn't read it. I handed it to him privately, later that afternoon, away from the rest of the family, and left him alone with it on the back porch. Whatever it said, he came back inside 20 minutes later with red eyes and nothing to say to anyone, and he left soon after without finishing his coffee. My father used to say, a good business is built so no single piece can be pulled out without the whole thing coming apart with it. For years I thought he meant the oak counter, the shelves, the store itself. He meant the people. He'd built something that couldn't be taken from the people who actually cared for it, not because he doubted us, but because he'd learned the hard way which of his sons needed that protection and which one didn't. Gary left the gathering early that day. He stayed on with the company for another year in a smaller role, before starting something of his own across town. Smaller, faster, entirely his. We speak now, carefully. The way the people speak after a long silence has taught them both something. He never told me what was in that letter, and I've never asked. Grace. Coleman still handles the trust. She stops by the store sometimes, more out of friendship now than obligation. Sarah works the front counter most Saturdays, learning the ledgers, the slow way, the way I did, pencil first, machine second. As for me, I still have the store and the oak counter, worn smooth under 40 more years of hands. I run my thumb along its edge most closing evenings, the way my father did. I think about him every time I hear that Bakoffa's door groan on its hinge, and I think, some things you protect with a lock. He protected this with patience, and with wood that couldn't be pulled apart. If you've ever had to let someone learn a hard lesson on their own, even someone you loved, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe. There are more to come.